Welcome back to the Game & Muscle YouTube channel. Now in this video we're going to be talking about the problem with car setups in driving simulators. And this is something that's been driving me crazy for the last 15 or so years that I've been sim racing, and I've kept it to myself, drinking my tea and you know, not letting it get to me too much. Twining's everyday tea, and Twining's English breakfast, by the way. Don't bother with Yorkshire tea bags or PG tips. You might as well just get some molten iron and dribble that down your throat. It's about as relaxing and smooth. Where were we? Setups. Okay, so the problem with setups is that with a good setup on a track, regardless of if you're a really good driver or an average driver, obviously if you're absolutely terrible it won't make any difference either way, so forget those people. And obviously if you're Greg or Hutu, you'll be good even if you were given a car with no wheels, so forget them people as well. But for your average to good to slightly better than good drivers that can typically drive relatively consistently, won't go wildly off to the Serengeti Joyride kebab shop every 2 or 3 laps, having a good setup will give them 1.5 to 2.5 seconds per lap. Obviously, it depends on the length of the track. If you had a good setup on the Nordschleife, you gain half a year of your life back. But, you know, on your average racetrack, Spa, Brands Hatch, Nürburgring GP, you know, you gain 1.5 to 2.5 seconds, depending on the car, just from the setup. Now, you might be thinking, that's not a problem, you know. Got a good setup, you get a faster lap, that's part of racing. You know, I do agree with that in some ways. The problem is that not everybody has access to that setup, or a baseline setup. Obviously there's no, well actually in simulators there probably is actually a singular best setup, but in general there's not normally a singular all-round best setup. There's going to be a spectrum of really good setups. But the problem is, not everyone has access to even one in that spectrum of good setups to start with. So when it comes to semi-casual, say public server racing, just online racing, and semi-casual league racing, you end up with this automatic gap that occurs purely from drivers that have a good setup and drivers that don't have a good setup. Now, what's the solution? Some of you are going to be just tearing your hair out, smashing your face into your table because you don't like me and you've decided to watch a video on my channel for some reason. I don't know, maybe you're a masochist. And you'll be saying, well, you should just learn how to bloody make setups, and the reward for making a good setup is that you're then competitive. But the problem with that is, not everybody wants to make setups. And I think it's fair that people that enjoy sim racing don't have an interest or shouldn't be expected to make a setup, especially if you look at real-world racing, where drivers typically pay a ton of money because they've decided basically rather than burn money in a campfire, they'd rather burn it in a car engine. They pay a ton of money, turn up at a track for a race meet, and a team will have set up the car at a basic level in a way that's generally competitive already in terms of car setup. The driver will then do some laps in the practice session, the qualifying, and will give some feedback, and the team will adjust that. The driver doesn't typically sit down with all the minutiae of the specifics of the car setup to get it within that general race pace. Now, obviously there are some drivers to the exception that do that. But if you look even at top level racing, Formula 1, GP2, well, it's Formula 2 now they've called it, but you know, racing where the drivers haven't even paid for the seat, they've been paid to drive, it's probably even less so that they will make the choices, because they'll have a whole team that specifically analyses all the data and goes through it and can focus all that time on making a setup, and then they just rely on the driver to actually be a good driver and work out how to get the most out of that car, bar maybe them having a general preference for it being more understeery than oversteery, or you know, like a general overall character. But the actual core details of what makes the car a fast car to lap will have been done for the driver. So with that in mind, it's utterly bizarre to me that simulators don't by default all come with a really newbie setup that's newbie's not the really fair thing to say, but a setup that's designed so maybe it's super understeery, so it's compatible with joysticks and gamepads and keyboards, because you can't really catch and maintain and balance counter steer with a gamepad or a binary input. You can if you're absolutely pro and the game's designed around it, but in general it's a lot harder than it is with a steering wheel to balance the car. So it makes sense to have a setup that's designed around that. It makes sense to also have a setup that's a very neutral setup and just represents the car at stock, which is I think actually that's what Kunos do, is that the default setups in the game are the car stock setups that the manufacturer puts out. I might be wrong about that, but I think that's what they do. So it makes sense to have that as well, because you know you want to experience what the car's like as per the manufacturer, which is nice. And then it makes sense to have maybe ideally at least one competitive setup, or maybe a couple. One competitive setup that's really loose and really low grip, one competitive setup that's maybe a bit more understeery. But you know what I mean, just having a selection of competitive setups per car, per track, by default in every simulator would make such a huge difference when it comes to public service semi-casual racing, in that it should completely eliminate that gap that just appears from people that have setups and those that don't. And the nice thing with this is it wouldn't ruin it for those people that actually do really enjoy doing car setups. You know, and they put the time into it, and they do get that marginal improvement, and they do get a setup that's custom tailored to themselves. And at the end of the day, you know, if you put the time into the setup, you will get something that's better for you, that you'll find more enjoyable. So there is worth in doing it if you happen to enjoy it. But if everyone at least has something that's competitive at a basic level, at least those people that have tweaked the setups won't be 2 seconds ahead and within 2 laps driving a separate race to people that are running off the defaults. I also think having good solid defaults in the game is the advantage that new drivers can go and look at those defaults and they can drive them. They can be like, oh okay, I see how that setup is a good setup. I see why the gearing is set up in a way that lets me use the maximum RPMs of the engine properly. I can see that the car tends to maybe be a bit oversteery where I thought cars should be understeery, or I can see how the car's now hooking up through that section of corners. And then that would really help guide someone in actually setting up a good setup, rather than them diving in to the James Bond villain shark pit and expected to somehow take out all the sharks with kung fu kicks immediately without training. They're being dropped into a shallow pond filled with tadpoles where they can actually get to grips with things, which is much less intimidating and far more conducive to actually getting people twiddling and fiddling with the setups and then enjoying the process and seeing what has a negative effect. It's much easier to do something and see what the negative effect is with something that you know that's positive than it is to have a complete blank slate and then try and chip out a statue of David without any prior knowledge of what's required to actually get a statue of David. Now, fortunately, though there typically is a lack of good defaults in driving simulators, some sims have actually tried to address this in the past and got really nice systems that do at least give a reasonable chance for people to get a hold of good setups for cars on specific tracks. Most notably is probably Race 07's and or it might be GTI Evolutions. One of the Simbin titles had a integrated online system in it where you could go through, look at the setups, and there would be setups. Typically people would post it with the time they got, and then there would be a community rating on them. Absolutely fantastic. Why isn't that in every game by default? I don't know. Well, actually I do. They've got to manage a back end and it's a FAFTA program. But it should be in every game by default. Secondly, Live for Speed had, though they didn't have a integrated sort of stuck in the sim setup that you can just grab, the actual setup sharing was really good in that you could message someone on a server. You say, hello matey, you're doing a really good setup, I hope you developed it, or did you just download it from a website, but I'd really like that setup. and then they could just click on your name and send it to you. And instantaneously, you would miraculously find yourself driving 1.5 to 2.5 seconds faster every lap, and you'd be driving close to them and having better online racing. So Live for Speed had for the most part, a really good system. Unfortunately, there's nothing like that in Assetto Corsa by default, but the guys at the Setup Tesco supermarket, the Setup Market, have coded an absolutely incredible app that lets you literally put the app in your game, sign up to the website, and then it's an emulation of what was in GTR Evolution, where you can see the setups for that track for the car you're currently on. You can download them all inside of the game. You can see which setup has been the most downloaded. Typically people post it with the lap time they've got, and Bob's your uncle, Fanny's your aunt. You have a setup that at the bare minimum is typically at least competitive. Now obviously some of the setups on there are absolute garbage, and you will find that you can't get setups for certain cars on certain tracks. But if it's a popular car on a popular track, you will tend to see that there's a setup that's been downloaded 100, 200 times, which is a fairly safe bet that it's at least a bog standard setup that will be better than the defaults that are already in the game. So in getting towards the end of this rant, Game of Muscle needs more teabags video, all I have to say is, come on developers, put some good, somewhat competitive setups in there. They don't have to be amazing setups, and obviously you've got competitive for different contexts of racing, if it's an endurance race, if it's a sprint race. But generally what I've found is if you've got a setup that's made for qualifying, even if you take that setup specifically made for qualifying and then you just put tyres that last longer on it, fill it up with more fuel, it will be better than the default setup by a mile, and you'll still gain that time advantage over the default. And ultimately most people that aren't heavily into setup making, I think people that are aliens and really get into sim racing, they will ultimately gravitate towards doing setup fiddling. But most people that are online doing the semi-casual racing that I talk about, that are really negatively affected by this setup lark, they typically are doing 5, 10, 15 lap races maximum, maybe 20 lap races. So it doesn't have to be a really tailored setup for an endurance race. Just something with qualifying with different tyres on it tends to do the trick. But there you go, I'm off to make another cup of tea. I've said the word so many times in this video, I've brainwashed myself into needing one. In the video I was driving with the SW20, and it's the Lotus Type 49 at the entirety of the Nordschleife. Driving was horrendous, but I was having good fun, so it doesn't matter. Don't forget to go to the Setup Market. You can download it from Race Department. You'll need to create an account on their website, and you can then get the app, put it in your game, and it solves a lot of the issues I was just talking about for the most part. So at least someone else has solved the problems. That's good. Thank you, Setup Market. That's Morrison Price. I don't even think that's their tagline. I'm going to do another video shortly after this where I'm going to talk about the apps that you need for Assetto Corsa, because there's some absolutely fantastic apps out there like the Setup Market. So look out for that. Don't forget to click the subscribe button if you want to be kept up to date with our incredible content that's virtual reality, gorgeous Ukrainian models, and the occasional, but not many, occasional sim racing video. Likey dislikey. Until the next one, goodbye chaps.